As government grows, so does frustration with government agencies that overstep their roles and push agendas that no longer serve the public interest. A prime example of this is found on the shores of Northern California in Point Reyes, where the Department of Interior is determined to close down the doors of the last oyster cannery in California, the Drakes Bay Oyster Company. This oyster operation supplies 1/3 of all oysters consumed in the state. But now a government agency has decided mankind should have limited use of this stretch of coast and are shutting down this small, family-owned business. Bureaucrats thousands of miles away have decided to turn this onshore-offshore area into a marine wilderness area, despite the fact that mankind has been operating ranches and an oyster cannery here for decades. This is a story of how extremely difficult it can be for the average American in rural areas to escape the heavy hand of government intrusion into their way of life. Millions of acres of rural public lands are used for agriculture and livestock production through agreements with Congress and farmers and ranchers. For decades, the Drakes Bay Oyster Company has leased offshore seabeds from Point Reyes National Seashore. But the Department of Interior decided they wanted to end that lease. They wanted an excuse to do so and set out on a witch hunt to find an environmental violation by the oyster operation. After an extensive environmental impact statement and the use of hidden cameras to monitor the activities of the oyster farm, they claimed that among other environmental problems, protected harbor seals were being harmed. And the superintendent of the National Seashore went so far as to threaten the owner of Drakes Bay Oyster Company with criminal action. None of the government's scientific studies held water. In fact, the National Academy of Science was directed by Senator Dianne Feinstein to review the government's case and found the government science to be faulty and concluded there was no environmental harm from the oyster operations and no reason why the farm couldn't continue to coexist with a healthy ecosystem in the bay. But despite the fact that every reason presented by the Department of Interior was ultimately discredited, Secretary Salazar, on his own discretion, made the decision to shut down this small family farm. The Lunny family has suffered enormous financial loss, both from lost revenues and massive legal bills. But the most difficult aspect of this battle has been the loss of confidence that the average citizens can get a fair, impartial outcome when federal agencies use agenda-driven science and personal crusades to trample on those making an honest living in rural America. The Lunny family now have exhausted all of their legal options. The last remaining course of action is a lawsuit from restaurants that depend on the oysters. Unless the courts intervene and force the Department of Interior to reverse course, the last oyster harvest from the last oyster cannery is just days away.
Drakes Bay Oyster Farm here represents about 55% of the total shellfish growing area leased by the California Fish and Game Commission. We produce about 30+% of all the oysters grown in the state of California. We operate the last oyster cannery in California. We have about 30+ employees, and all our food that we produce here remains locally. 100% of our product is distributed within the San Francisco Bay Area. One thing that we're doing in the tradition of oyster farming in Drakes Estero is we're producing food on public land. And this is actually a tradition that began around the turn of the century. It began to be permitted by Cal Fish and Game in the 1930s, and today is no different. We're producing food for a local economy and a local food shed on this public land. We think it's a great opportunity of collaborative conservation. It's a great chance to use public land in an appropriate fashion. At the same time, we're conserving natural resources. We don't see anything unusual or improper about growing food sustainably on public land. I was born and raised here on Point Reyes. Our ranch overlooks Drakes Estero, where the oysters live. Been involved with food production my whole life. This oyster farm is about almost 100 years old. It's been permitted by California Department of Fish and Game since the 1930s. In about the 1960s, this area, the Point Reyes National Seashore, was created around Point Reyes, just north of San Francisco, and it became a unit of the National Park Service. The ranches that completely surround Drake's Estero are all still operating in what's called the pastoral zone, a working landscape. And the oyster farm is in the middle of that working landscape as part of the overall coastal community and coastal dependent use. Now what we see happening is those early agreements where all the ranchers and the oyster farmer would be able to stay. We see a few new people who are taking over control, who are deciding they didn't like those agreements made by Congress, made by our forefathers to our parents, and are deciding that they have a new vision of how Point Reyes National Seashore will be used in the future, and that would be a humanless landscape by removing people, by removing agriculture, and pretending that it never existed. When Congress passed legislation that gave the Secretary of the Interior full authority to issue a permit to the Drakes Bay Oyster Company to continue, Interior decided that the National Environmental Policy Act is required and that a full environmental impact statement was required. What we saw come from there was a compilation of science that's been done behind closed doors. We would find people doing research projects out in the Estero without even our knowledge. They wouldn't even tell us about it. And then when the document was completed, it was riddled with errors. And don't take my word for it, take the National Academy of Sciences' word for it. Take researchers from different universities' words for it. Local environmentalists who have seen this and are embarrassed by it. Yet that's the document that informed the Secretary of the Department of Interior to make a decision to throw out Drakes Bay Oyster Farm. He admitted that it helped inform his decision. So what we see is a case of a disastrous misuse of science, that if it can be this bad, I have a feeling no one has a chance anywhere unless we can get science put back in its rightful place. We often wonder, and we're often asked, what's behind all this? What possesses someone to manipulate science, to make things up, to misrepresent, to fabricate, to say things they know full well are incorrect because they want to drive policy with false science? They have already made policy decisions, they have goals, they have agendas, and they're willing to, say things that are completely untrue. I have a hard time understanding that. I have a hard time believing that there's any agenda that's that important to undermine science, because we really believe that all good policy decisions are based on good science. That's how we make our decisions. What happens from decisions that are based on false science, like what's happening here at Point Reyes National Seashore, will undermine credibility of science everywhere else, and until we get to a point that no one knows what to believe. So we believe that in cases like this, there needs to be some accountability. These false claims need to be reconsidered. We need an outside body to consider it and correct it so that it doesn't undermine science everywhere. If the Park Service is successful in evicting this historic use, the result will be a huge damage to our local economy, because we right now bring in about 50,000 visitors a year that come to the farm. Well, they shop in our local shops, they go to our local restaurants, they go to our bed and breakfast. So locally, it's a big impact. But even on a broader sense, we have the national trade deficit, the balance of trade for seafood, is the worst trade deficit of anything, second just to oil. There's almost a $10 billion seafood trade deficit. We can't even come close to producing enough shellfish domestically to meet domestic demand. So we're already shipping in from overseas. So all this food that we produce in Drake's Estero is going to have to be replaced from usually Asia. A lot of it will come from Korea, And so we really have what's going to happen is it's going to increase prices to local restaurants. It's also going to reduce food safety, quality. Well, there'll be a lot of things that are going to take a hit. The one thing that concerns me is what's happening here affects so many people. It affects all our staff. 30 families are going to lose their income. Half of those people are going to lose their homes. They live on the farm. They're highly skilled. They're sophisticated in what they do. In the last oyster cannery in California, where are they going to take the skill? Where are they going to move to? These people grew up, they raised their kids with our kids. They've gone to our schools. They go to our churches. And when you stop and think about this horrible effect, this one decision, this is the federal government. How many families across the nation are going to face this same kind of abuse? We've already been contacted, since this has gotten some visibility, people have contacted us from all over saying, oh my gosh, it's happening to me too. So what I think is important, if nothing else, even if we are thrown out, is that it doesn't repeat itself. It doesn't happen to other good families. It doesn't happen to other good staff when they haven't done anything wrong.